I am Leo, 32 years old. For 3 solid decades, my own flesh and blood treated me like I was a financial burden and an embarrassing mistake they simply had to tolerate. While I was standing right there in the grand lobby of a luxury resort, my own mother looked at me and told everyone she thought I wouldn't even show up. She made sure the entire family heard it, turning me into the punchline of their cruel joke yet again. But there was one massive thing they did not know. That 5-star hotel with its impeccable gardens, private beaches, and million-dollar ocean view now belonged completely to me. And very soon they were going to realize they were standing in my house, sleeping in my beds and playing by my rules. Before I tell you exactly what went down, hit that like button if you believe in justice. And let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now let's go back to how it all started. The annual family reunion was a mandatory tradition my mother, Eleanor, insisted on maintaining at all costs. For most families, a reunion is about catching up, sharing a Thanksgiving dinner, or just enjoying each other's company. For my family, it was a competitive sport. It was a long weekend of constant comparisons, cutting remarks, and a stark reminder of exactly where I stood in the brutal family hierarchy. This year was supposed to be no different from the rest, except for one massive secret I was carrying. The luxurious Miramar Hotel where we were all staying was now my property. My grandfather had secretly left it to me through a completely ironclad inheritance 6 months earlier. When I arrived at the lobby of the Miramar, my heart was beating fast. The place was breathtaking. Grandfather Arthur had built it from the ground up, and you could see his touch everywhere. The floors were imported Italian marble, the ceilings featured hand-painted frescoes, and a massive crystal chandelier hung right in the center of the room, catching the afternoon sunlight and scattering it across the walls. I stood near a large marble pillar, keeping a low profile, and just watched the spectacle unfold. I watched as my older brother Julian, the undisputed golden child of the family, was welcomed with tight hugs and bright smiles by everyone. Julian was a 35-year-old investment banker who treated every conversation like a high-stakes pitch meeting. His wife, Victoria, clung to his arm, heavily draped in designer labels, flashing her diamond ring like it was a shield against the working class. My father, Richard, was patting Julian on the back, loudly congratulating him on some recent corporate promotion. No one noticed my presence. I was entirely invisible until my mother, Eleanor, finally turned around to check the luggage carts. When she saw me, her bright, camera-ready smile instantly vanished, replaced by a deep, undisguised frown. She wore a pristine white pantsuit that screamed old money, though our family's money was mostly tied up in heavy mortgages and aggressive car loans. "I thought you wouldn't come, Leo," she said, her voice carrying across the lobby. She didn't even bother to hide her disappointment. I looked at her, feeling that familiar sting in my chest. It was the same feeling I got when I was 10 years old and she forgot to pick me up from school because she was busy at a country club luncheon. But I pushed the feeling down. I tightened my grip on my duffel bag and told her I wouldn't miss our family reunion for anything in the world. I gave her a smile that completely failed to reach my eyes. Julian walked over, looking me up and down. He had this arrogant smirk he always wore when he was about to say something terrible. He evaluated my outfit, making a big show of checking out my plain, unbranded jacket. "Seems like the graphic design business isn't so lucrative after all," Julian commented with a mocking smile. "You know, Leo, if you need help setting up a 401k, I can have one of my junior analysts look at your meager earnings. It is never too late to start saving for a rainy day." If only they knew the reality of my situation. My small company was now a highly respected agency with international clients. I was pulling in serious revenue, securing massive commercial contracts, and quietly building a solid real estate portfolio on the side. My salary alone eclipsed Julian's entire department's budget. But I never bothered to correct their assumptions. Let them think what they wanted. What hurt me most wasn't the petty insult to my career. It was the massive secret I kept weighing heavily on my shoulders. Grandfather had always seen something in me that the rest of the family deliberately ignored. He saw a builder while they only saw a disappointment. Then came the moment to distribute the rooms. My mother stood there proudly at the concierge desk, acting like the absolute queen of the castle. She announced the assignments loudly as the general manager, Thomas, handed out the heavy brass keys. "Julian and Victoria, you have the presidential suite with the panoramic ocean view," she announced happily. Julian took the key with a smug nod. "Your father and I will take the executive suite on the top floor," she continued. "The cousins, Clara, and the rest, you are all in the deluxe rooms on the 5th floor. And then there was me." She looked at her list, then looked at me with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Leo, you will stay in room 108 on the 1st floor," she stated. It was the room directly next to the industrial laundry room, undoubtedly the smallest, dampest, and noisiest room in the entire hotel. Everyone exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some of my extended relatives looked away with a bit of shame, while others, like Julian and Victoria, barely disguised their amusement. Thomas, the manager, looked visibly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting between me and my mother. He knew exactly who I was. He was the one sending me the weekly financial reports. He tried to intervene, his voice tight with professional panic. "Ma'am, we could certainly look for another option for the young man," Thomas began politely. "We have several junior suites available on higher floors." But my mother interrupted him instantly, her tone sharp and final. "It's not necessary. Leo is simple. He doesn't need luxuries." I saw how Thomas looked at me with deep concern. He was terrified I was going to fire him on the spot for letting this happen. But we had a strict prior agreement to keep my position as the absolute owner a total secret during this family reunion. I gave Thomas a very subtle nod, telling him to back down and play along. "It's fine, Thomas," I said calmly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Room 108 will be perfect." I took the brass key from his shaking hand and headed straight to the service elevator, feeling the heavy, judgmental eyes of my family burning into my back. On the way, I clearly heard my cousin Clara whisper to Aunt Beatrice. "As always, Leo settles for the leftovers," Clara whispered. Walking down that 1st floor hallway felt like descending into a submarine. The rhythmic, heavy thumping of the massive industrial washing machines grew louder with every single step. The air smelled strongly of industrial bleach and damp linen. The room was exactly as I remembered from years ago when I used to visit the staff areas with my grandfather. It was incredibly small, featuring a single barred window that overlooked a bleak service alleyway, completely dominated by the constant, deafening noise of the laundry machines. I dropped my bag on the single, creaky bed, sat down on the thin mattress, and took a deep breath. The vibrations from the washing machines literally shook the floorboards. I wasn't here to simply confront my family or to humiliate them right out of the gate by revealing I was the owner. I was here to understand the root of the sickness in our bloodline. I needed to understand exactly why they treated me this way. Why, after over 30 years of me trying to be a good son and a good brother, they still saw me as the least valuable person in our family. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Sterling, my grandfather's fiercely loyal lawyer. The text read, "Everything is in place. The legal documents are secured. Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this?" I stared at the screen for a long time. The washing machines next door shifted into their spin cycle, rattling the cheap mirror on the wall. I locked the screen, shoved the phone back into my pocket, and stood up. I was more sure than I had ever been in my entire life. That night, the welcome dinner at the hotel's 5-star restaurant was a masterclass in passive-aggressive family dynamics. The restaurant was stunning, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the moonlit ocean. My family had practically taken over the dining room, occupying the absolute best table right in the center of the room. It was a massive circular table draped in fine white linen. My chair, however, was pushed to the very end, partially hidden behind a massive decorative marble column. I felt like a ghost haunting my own family dinner. I had to lean forward just to see the people speaking. While everyone else was aggressively ordering the most expensive dishes on the menu, Wagyu steaks, imported lobsters, truffle risottos, and bottles of vintage wine, I looked at the waiter and calmly ordered a simple house salad. My father, Richard, leaned across the table. He had this specific look on his face, a toxic, familiar mixture of mockery and fake pity. "Can't you afford something better, Leo?" my father asked loudly, ensuring the tables nearby could hear him. "We can treat you if you want. I know the graphic design world isn't exactly paying for beachfront vacations." I kept my eyes level with his. I didn't let a single ounce of anger show on my face. "The salad is fine. Thank you," I replied, maintaining my absolute dignity. The conversation quickly shifted back to its usual center of gravity. Julian. It revolved endlessly around Julian's latest achievements, his massive bonus at the investment firm, his bloated salary, and his brand new house in an exclusive, gated neighborhood governed by a strict HOA. Julian took a long, dramatic sip of his red wine and loudly began bragging about the brand new Ferrari he had just bought. He talked about the custom leather stitching, the ridiculous horsepower, and the sheer amount of cash he dropped on the down payment. My father raised his glass in a toast, calling Julian the true pride of this family. My mother beamed like she had just won the lottery, her eyes shining with absolute adoration for her eldest son. Then she turned her attention to me, her expression instantly hardening. "Our Julian always knew what he wanted," my mother said proudly. "Not like Leo, who wasted his life with this drawing business." I focused on my water glass. The graphic design business she was insulting so casually had recently landed a major corporate branding contract that would probably buy Julian's Ferrari 10 times over. I had over 30 employees on payroll, but I let the silence hang. I let them dig their own graves with their arrogance. Suddenly, the kitchen doors swung open. The head chef, Marcel, approached our table to personally greet the VIP guests. Marcel was a culinary genius I had personally recruited from a Michelin-starred restaurant in Chicago. The entire table quieted down, expecting him to fawn over Julian and my father. They sat up straighter, ready to accept his praise. But upon seeing me sitting quietly at the end of the table behind the column, Marcel stopped dead in his tracks. He bypassed my father entirely. He walked straight up to me and made a small, deeply respectful bow that definitely didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the table. "Was the salad to your liking, Mr. Leo?" Marcel asked respectfully, his tone completely deferential. "Delicious, Marcel. Thank you," I replied evenly, giving him a small nod. My family looked at me strangely, their faces contorted in pure, unadulterated confusion. Julian slammed his heavy wine glass down on the table, spilling a few drops on the pristine white tablecloth. "You know the chef?" Julian asked, his voice sharp and completely surprised. "We've crossed paths before," I replied vaguely, not giving an inch. The absolute truth was that I had personally hired Marcel 3 months earlier after my grandfather left me the hotel. I offered him a salary and a creative freedom package he simply couldn't refuse. But they didn't need to know that yet. Aunt Beatrice, who always loved to stir the pot while pretending to be the innocent peacemaker, quickly chimed in. "Oh, Leo probably knows him from delivering promotional flyers to the restaurant's back door," she laughed, effectively changing the subject back to Julian's new luxury lifestyle. Everyone chuckled. I just ate my salad. As the night progressed and the expensive wine bottles emptied, the comments directed at me became sharper, more cutting, and increasingly relentless. They mocked my lack of a trust fund, my supposed inability to afford a mortgage, and my overall failure to live up to the family name. The massive secret I kept was weighing on me more and more. Should I just drop the bomb? Should I reveal the truth right then and there? What would they do if they suddenly realized that every single insult, every calculated humiliation they threw at me, occurred right under my own roof? Eventually, I politely excused myself and retreated back to my room. Room 108. The loud, mechanical humming of the laundry machines vibrated aggressively through the thin, cheap walls, shaking the headboard of my bed. I lay there in the dark, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, and my mind drifted back to my grandfather, Arthur. Grandfather Arthur was a literal force of nature. He built his empire from absolutely nothing, starting with a small roadside motel and turning it into a hospitality powerhouse. He despised the pretentious country club culture my parents and brother worshipped. When I was a teenager, while Julian was out playing golf and sucking up to rich kids with trust funds, I spent my summers sitting quietly in grandfather's office. He taught me how to read balance sheets, how to understand complex real estate markets, and most importantly, how to value the hardworking people on the ground floor. 6 months ago, when he passed away, the family expected a massive, life-changing payout. They expected the hotel to be sold and the cash distributed evenly so they could pay off their massive debts and buy more shiny toys. But grandfather had another plan entirely. He saw the deep rot in the family. He knew their financial irresponsibility, their obsession with status over substance. That was why he left it all to me. A soft, urgent knock on the door pulled me aggressively out of my memories. I opened it to find Thomas standing in the dim hallway, looking incredibly nervous. He glanced over his shoulder before slipping inside quickly. He handed me a thick, heavy manila folder. "I found what you asked for, sir," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely audible over the washing machines next door. I took the folder. The label on the front was faded, but the contents were highly explosive. Thomas had spent the last 2 weeks digging through the deep, hidden archives of the hotel's legal history at my specific request. I thanked him, locked the door behind him, and sat down at the tiny, wobbly desk in the corner. I flipped open the folder, completely unaware that what I was about to read would fundamentally and permanently destroy whatever lingering affection I had left for my family. The next morning, the sun rose brilliantly over the ocean, casting a warm golden light over the resort. But inside my chest, a freezing, violent storm was brewing. The morning passed with various luxury activities meticulously organized by my parents. There was a private, guided tour of the hotel's art collection, exclusive time booked at the infinity pool, and incredibly expensive massages scheduled at the world-class spa. Of course, my parents had carefully organized everything so that Julian and his wife received the absolute best treatments available. They were booked for the 90-minute deep tissue couples massage with hot stones. For me, there were only the leftovers. I walked into the serene, eucalyptus-scented spa lobby, only to be met by my mother. She stood near the front desk with a look of false, theatrical disappointment plastered across her face. "I'm sorry, Leo, but it seems there's absolutely no more space for the premium massage," she informed me, crossing her arms. "You'll have to settle for the basic, 30-minute chair massage in the lounge." I looked over at the young receptionist behind the counter. She quickly lowered her eyes, her hands shaking slightly over the keyboard. She was clearly terrified. Later that day, I logged into the hotel's management system from my laptop and checked the reservation logs myself. I discovered the ugly truth. My mother had deliberately and maliciously canceled my reservation for the premium treatment that morning. She explicitly claimed to the spa staff that it would be a complete waste of money on someone like Leo. It was petty. It was unnecessarily cruel. And honestly, it barely even registered as painful anymore. I was completely numb to her cruelty. That afternoon, while my parents and Julian were out enjoying a private, catered luxury yacht tour on the bay, I quietly slipped out of the public areas. I walked down the restricted executive hallway and unlocked the door to my grandfather's old office, which was now legally my private office. The heavy mahogany doors closed silently behind me, instantly shutting out the ambient noise of the resort. Thomas was already there waiting for me, standing stiffly next to a large cardboard box overflowing with old documents. "I brought the rest of the personal files you requested, sir," Thomas said, placing the heavy box directly on the center of the massive oak desk. "These are all your grandfather's personal documents related to the family." I nodded and dismissed Thomas, needing to be completely alone for this. I sat down in my grandfather's heavy leather chair, the leather worn soft from years of his use. I began carefully reviewing the stacks of letters, old photographs, and private, handwritten diaries. I was searching for answers, looking for the core reason behind my family's relentless, multi-generational hostility. Buried near the bottom of the box, Tucked inside a leather portfolio, I found a yellowed envelope dated exactly 15 years ago. It contained a handwritten letter from my mother to my grandfather. I unfolded the crisp paper, recognizing her sharp, elegant handwriting immediately. The words on the page literally left me breathless. "Dad, you have to understand that Leo isn't like us. He never was." The letter read, "If you continue treating him as your favorite, you'll only hurt him in the long run. He lacks the killer instinct. He doesn't have what it takes to succeed in this family. Julian is the one who should inherit the hotel someday. You need to cut Leo out of the financial planning before he ruins everything." My hands were physically shaking holding the paper. I dug deeper into the box and continued reading similar correspondence spanning over a decade. There were dozens of letters where my own mother actively and aggressively tried to convince my grandfather that I didn't deserve his attention, his love, or his inheritance. Letters where she systematically described my supposed failures, exaggerated my childhood mistakes, and begged him to cut me out of his life completely. And then I found the real bombshell. It was a thick legal folder containing draft contracts, aggressive emails, and unauthorized banking records. It documented in terrifying detail how my father, Richard, and my brother, Julian, had actively tried to manipulate my grandfather into selling them the hotel at a massively reduced, borderline illegal price shortly before his death. They had fabricated financial distress reports. They had even contacted a shady lawyer to draft a lawsuit questioning grandfather's mental competency, aiming to forcefully push him out of his own legacy and take over the board of directors. Their pathetic, greedy plan had failed only because grandfather grew suspicious of their sudden interest in the property's deeds. He hired private investigators, uncovered their plot, and decided to completely bypass them. He secretly left the entire multi-million-dollar empire to me in an ironclad trust. I sat there in the absolute silence of the office, the air feeling impossibly heavy in my lungs. The discovery hit me like a massive, freezing wave. It wasn't just simple envy or basic sibling rivalry. My own mother had systematically and deliberately orchestrated my marginalization within the family for years. My father and brother had tried to rob a dying man, their own flesh and blood. A sharp, demanding knock on the heavy wooden door violently interrupted my investigation. Before I could even answer, the door swung open, and standing there was my cousin, Clara. She froze in the doorway, her eyes wide, looking completely bewildered. "Leo, what the hell are you doing in here? This area is strictly for authorized personnel only," she said, her eyes narrowing suspiciously as she looked at the sensitive documents scattered all over the large desk. Thomas, who had been standing guard in the outer hallway, intervened quickly, stepping in front of her to try and cover for me. The young man was just looking for some basic information about the hotel's historical activities. "Miss Clara?" he said smoothly, trying to usher her out. Clara didn't seem convinced at all. Her eyes darted around the room, carefully examining the luxurious office, the dominant position I was sitting in behind the desk, and the sheer, undeniable authority radiating from the space. "Isn't it strange that they let you into the private executive office?" Clara asked, her voice dripping with suspicion and challenge. "They wouldn't even let Julian take a quick look inside when he asked this morning." I looked up at her. I didn't scramble to hide the papers. I didn't apologize. My expression was completely unreadable. "Maybe I'm not as insignificant as everyone thinks," I replied coldly, holding her gaze steadily. Something instantly changed in her expression. The arrogance melted away. For the very first time in my life, I saw a genuine glimmer of doubt and fear in her eyes. "You were always grandfather's favorite," she said slowly, almost to herself, backing away slightly. "We all knew it, even though no one would ever admit it out loud." When Clara finally backed out of the office and the door clicked shut, I knew the clock was officially ticking. My secret wouldn't last much longer. The family would start to piece things together, they would start to suspect, and I would be forced to make a massive decision. I could either continue enduring their pathetic humiliations to keep the peace, or I could reveal that I, the deeply despised and mocked Leo, was now the absolute owner of the massive empire they all violently coveted. The afternoon stretched out with an unbearable, suffocating tension. I could feel Clara watching me from a distance whenever I walked through the common areas. She was whispering frantically to Aunt Beatrice near the lobby bar, her eyes constantly darting in my direction. The family dynamic was subtly shifting, but the main culprits, my parents and Julian, were entirely oblivious to the ground crumbling beneath their feet. Out by the infinity pool, Julian and his arrogant business partner Marcus were holding court. They were drinking highly expensive, imported cocktails, acting loud and obnoxious, taking up prime real estate on the VIP sun loungers. As I walked past the pool deck holding a bottle of water, Julian couldn't resist taking another public shot at me. "Hey Leo," Julian called out loudly, making sure the guests nearby heard him. "You should probably take some notes on the hotel's architecture. Maybe it'll help you draw better logos for your little startup. If you ask nicely, maybe Dad will lend you the money to buy a decent laptop." Marcus laughed, a loud, grating sound that echoed across the water. My father chuckled from his lounge chair, not even bothering to correct Julian's behavior. I didn't even break my stride. I didn't flush with anger. I felt nothing but cold, clinical detachment. Let them have their cheap laughs. Let them enjoy the sun. Their fabricated reality was about to violently collapse around them. I retreated to a quiet, shaded corner of the botanical gardens, away from the prying eyes of my relatives. I pulled out my phone and dialed Sterling's private number. He picked up on the very first ring. "Is it time, Leo?" His deep, gravelly voice came through the speaker. He had been my grandfather's legal bulldog for 40 years, and he had been waiting for this day just as much as I had. "It's time, Sterling," I said, staring out at the waves crashing violently against the coastal rocks. "Tonight is the formal gala dinner. I want you here. Bring all the final trust documents, the ownership transition papers, and every single evidence file we compiled regarding my father's attempted fraud. I want everything locked and loaded." "Understood," Sterling replied smoothly. "I've already notified the local authorities to be on standby just in case your father tries anything stupid regarding the property. I'll be there right before the main course is served." I hung up the phone and walked back into the massive hotel. The storm wasn't just coming anymore. I was actively directing it. I went back to room 108 one last time. The laundry machines were finally quiet. Thomas had quietly slipped inside earlier and left a heavy, black canvas garment bag hanging on the back of the closet door. I unzipped it slowly. Inside was a bespoke, perfectly tailored dark navy suit I had commissioned specifically for this trip. It wasn't flashy like the loud designer labels Julian wore with massive logos plastered everywhere. It was quiet luxury, the kind of suit that screamed generational wealth, immense power, and absolute authority. I took a long, cold shower, the freezing water washing away the last remaining remnants of the old submissive Leo. I dried off, put on the crisp white dress shirt, fastened the heavy silk tie, and slipped my arms into the jacket. To fit like an absolute second skin. I stood in front of the small, cheap, water-stained mirror above the dresser. The man staring back wasn't the punching bag of the family anymore. He wasn't the disappointment who settled for the worst room. He was the CEO. He was the sole beneficiary. He was the man who held the keys to the entire kingdom. When I finally stepped out of room 108 and walked down the main, brightly lit corridor toward the grand ballroom, the shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The hotel staff, who had been thoroughly briefed by Thomas about the impending revelation, no longer bothered to hide their respect. As I walked past the concierge desk, the staff members stopped what they were doing and stood up completely straight. The bellhops gave me deep, respectful nods. The security guards tightened their posture, their hands resting near their radios. They knew exactly who I was. They knew I was the man who signed their paychecks, the man who had increased their benefits, and they were ready to watch me reclaim my territory from the parasites who had tried to steal it. I walked purposefully toward the grand dining hall. The sound of a live classical string quartet drifted through the heavy, ornate double doors. Tonight, at the formal dinner, The massive storm that had been brewing since the very moment of my arrival would finally break. And with it would come the brutal, undeniable opportunity for absolute justice I never even knew I wanted. I took one final, deep breath, adjusting my cuffs. I reached out, pushed the heavy doors open, and stepped into the blinding light of the ballroom. The grand ballroom of the Miramar Hotel was an absolute masterclass in classic, old-world architectural opulence. As I walked down the long, heavily carpeted corridor toward the double doors, I could feel the heavy bass of a live string quartet vibrating through the floorboards. My grandfather, Arthur, had personally designed this room back in the late 70s. The ceiling stretched over 30 feet high, intricately adorned with hand-carved mahogany crown molding and cascading crystal chandeliers that threw fractured, golden, and amber light across the entire room. Freshly cut white orchids, my grandmother's favorite flower before she passed, sat perfectly arranged in heavy, polished silver vases on every single table. The air smelled of roasted garlic, expensive truffle oil, and that subtle, sharp scent of generational wealth. Tonight was the formal gala dinner. This was the absolute central, crowning event of our annual family reunion. It was the one specific night of the year where everyone in my bloodline dressed up in their finest clothes to desperately pretend they were wealthier, happier, and infinitely more successful than they actually were. I took a deep breath, adjusting the cuffs of my crisp white shirt. I was wearing the bespoke dark navy suit I had commissioned specifically for this trip. It wasn't a flashy designer piece with a logo plastered on the chest like the ones my brother preferred. It was tailored to the exact millimeter, the kind of quiet luxury that spoke volumes to anyone who actually knew what to look for. I pushed the heavy oak double doors open and stepped inside, deliberately arriving late to ensure the family was already seated and comfortable in their illusions. The room was buzzing with the low, sophisticated murmur of wealthy guests. My family had, of course, completely bypassed the standard seating chart and aggressively secured the absolute best table in the entire room. It was a massive circular setup situated right next to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the moonlit ocean, offering a panoramic view of the crashing waves. When I finally approached the table, my mother, Eleanor, looked up from her heavy crystal glass of vintage Pinot Noir. Her face, meticulously made up for the evening, instantly tightened into a familiar, rigid mask of deep irritation. "Finally, you appear, Leo," she said sharply, her voice carrying just loudly enough to make a wealthy elderly couple at the neighboring table glance over in our direction. "We were literally about to order the main courses without you. Sit down, please, and try not to knock anything over. And look at you wearing such a plain suit to a gala. I suppose it's the best you could do on a designer's budget." I didn't react to the bait. I simply nodded to my father and took my assigned place. Unsurprisingly, they had given me the absolute worst spot at the table. A chair positioned awkwardly near a massive marble column and directly in the path of the busy waiter's service station. I sat down smoothly, unbuttoning my jacket. I didn't say a single word. I just sat back, steepled my fingers, and watched them. Julian, my older brother, was already half drunk. His face was flushed a deep, blotchy red, and his expensive silk tie was loosened around his neck. He was aggressively holding court, dominating the conversation, bragging loudly about his recent real estate investments to my father, Aunt Beatrice, and a few younger cousins who were desperately trying to curry favor with the golden child. "I'm telling you, Dad, I bought 3 prime commercial properties on the coast just last month," Julian boasted, leaning back in his chair, swirling his red wine so aggressively it almost sloshed over the rim. "The commercial market is absolutely ripe for the taking right now if you actually have the liquid capital and the killer instinct to move fast. If I play my cards right with this upcoming promotion at the investment firm, I could probably even buy a luxury resort exactly like this one someday. Turn it into a real cash cow. Cut the staff, automate the services, maximize the margins." Victoria, his wife, smiled proudly, her teeth stark white against her tan. She reached out and placed her heavily manicured hand, adorned with a massive diamond ring, right over his. "My husband has true, undeniable business vision," she announced to the entire table. making sure her voice projected. She then shot a sidelong, pitying glance at me. Unlike some other family members who are perfectly content just sitting at a desk, drawing little logos on a computer all day for pennies, my father, Richard, let out a booming, hearty laugh. He raised his heavy crystal glass toward Julian and Victoria, his eyes shining with a pride he had never, not once, directed at me. To Julian and Victoria, my father proclaimed loudly, the true pride, the ultimate success story, and the absolute future of this family. May your portfolio always grow. Everyone around the large table eagerly raised their glasses and toasted. They clinked their crystal, drinking deeply to Julian's entirely fabricated, debt-ridden success. I kept my water glass resting flat on the white linen tablecloth. I didn't touch it. I didn't move. No one even seemed to notice my blatant lack of participation during the first course. They were all far too busy gorging themselves on jumbo lump crab cakes and imported caviar, completely absorbed in their own echo chamber of arrogance. But my cousin Clara was watching me. Ever since she caught me sitting behind grandfather's desk in the restricted executive office that afternoon, she had been vibrating with a nervous, frantic energy. She kept taking small, quick sips of her water, her eyes darting between me and the rest of the table. Finally, as the waiters cleared the appetizer plates, she couldn't hold it in any longer. Leo, Clara spoke up, her voice slicing cleanly through the clatter of silverware. I saw you today in the hotel's private executive office, in the restricted wing. You seemed incredibly comfortable sitting behind that desk. In fact, you looked like you belonged there. A sudden, heavy, suffocating silence instantly fell over the massive table. Forks stopped midway to mouths. All eyes slowly turned to me. The lively string quartet in the background suddenly sounded very, very far away. My father frowned deeply, his thick eyebrows pulling together. He set his wine glass down with a heavy, dangerous thud. What exactly were you doing in restricted areas, Leo? He demanded to know, his tone instantly shifting from a jovial patriarch to an aggressive interrogator. Are you trying to get us all thrown out of here? We have a reputation to maintain. You can't just wander around VIP areas like a lost tourist. I picked up my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cold water wet my throat, and set it back down precisely where it was. I looked him dead in the eye. I was just investigating some things about the hotel's internal operations and history, I replied casually, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. Why on earth would you do that? My mother asked, letting out a short, incredulous laugh. Her voice was dripping with pure, unadulterated condescension. It's not like you are ever going to be in a position to buy a hotel like this. You still rent an apartment, for God's sake. Stick to your crayons, Leo. Julian let out a thunderous, mocking laugh that echoed loudly in the quiet ballroom. Leo owning a hotel? Now that would be a hilarious joke, he sneered, pointing a finger at me. The guy can't even afford a decent room on a family vacation. He's sleeping next to the washing machines. He is probably just trying to figure out how to steal the complimentary luxury bathrobes without getting caught by security. It was at that exact, perfect, cinematic moment that Thomas, the general manager of the Miramar, approached our table. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by two senior servers dressed in immaculate white tuxedos. Thomas was carrying a heavy silver ice bucket holding a massive, incredibly rare bottle of exclusive vintage champagne. It was a specific reserve bottle that cost more than most people's monthly salary. A bottle my grandfather used to save only for visiting dignitaries. Thomas stepped up to the table with absolute, undeniable professional grace. He completely ignored my father and Julian, directing his full attention solely to me. Mr. Leo, the vintage champagne you requested for your family, he said clearly, his voice carrying maximum authority and deep respect. My mother blinked rapidly in total, profound confusion. She looked at Thomas, then at the massive bottle of champagne, and then back at Thomas. Excuse me, sir. There must be a massive mistake. We certainly didn't order any champagne. We are drinking Pinot Noir, she said, her voice laced with panic. likely terrified of the impending bill. "It's entirely complimentary tonight, ma'am," Thomas replied smoothly, offering a polite, practiced smile. "From the management?" Julian asked, puffing out his chest, automatically assuming his perceived VIP status and loud bragging had earned them a high-roller freebie. He reached out to grab the bottle. "From me?" I interrupted calmly, my voice slicing through the air like a razor blade as I locked eyes with my brother. Julian's hand stopped in mid-air. He almost choked on his own saliva. He stared at me, his face twisting in a violent mixture of disbelief and sudden anger. "From you?" He practically spat the words out. "How the hell could you afford a bottle of wine that probably costs more than your entire monthly rent? Did you max out a credit card just to show off?" Thomas expertly popped the cork with a soft, satisfying sigh. He began pouring the sparkling golden liquid into the tall crystal flutes while I maintained my absolute, unbreakable composure. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. You could hear a pin drop. "There are a great many things about me you don't know, Julian," I said simply, leaning forward just a fraction, resting my forearms on the table. My father looked at me with deep, narrowing suspicion. His sharp business instincts, honed over decades of ruthless corporate maneuvering, were finally kicking in, screaming at him that something was very, very wrong. "What exactly are you talking about, Leo?" he demanded, leaning over his plate. "If you have something to say to this family, spit it out right now. Stop playing games." I sat back and contemplated my options. I could reveal my massive secret right this very second. I could humiliate them publicly, exactly as they had humiliated me for the last 30 years. The sweet, intoxicating revenge they so richly deserved would be served to them on a silver platter. But as I observed their faces, the sheer arrogance, the bottomless greed, the deep-seated, pathetic insecurity, I knew I needed to dismantle them piece by piece. I didn't want to just blow up the building. I wanted to take it apart brick by brick so they could see the foundation was rotten. I looked at my mother, softening my expression just a bit to keep them off balance. I didn't mean anything by it. I just wanted to make a kind, generous gesture, I replied smoothly, to celebrate that we're all sitting here together as a family, enjoying this beautiful resort, despite everything that has happened in the past. The surprise on their faces was absolutely evident. It was written in the wide eyes of my mother and the confused scowl of my father. They didn't expect grace or generosity from me, especially not after how brutally they had treated me over the past 48 hours, shoving me into a closet-sized room and mocking my livelihood. The dinner continued, the waiters bringing out the main courses of filet mignon and sea bass, but the atmosphere had subtly and permanently changed. Clara kept looking at me with intense, burning intrigue, clearly reconsidering everything she thought she knew about me. Aunt Beatrice was unusually quiet, her eyes darting nervously around the room. During the dessert course, while the servers were clearing the heavy dinner plates and bringing out delicate chocolate soufflés, Julian couldn't let the tension go. His ego simply wouldn't allow it. He had to reassert dominance. He began talking about grandfather Arthur's inheritance, a topic that always burned a massive hole in his stomach because he felt he had been robbed. I will never, for the life of me, understand why the old man sold this incredible hotel in secret right before he died, Julian complained bitterly, staring around the opulent room, practically drooling at the revenue potential. "It was our family patrimony. It was our birthright. Dad, you should have been running this place. And I should have been sitting on the board." Maybe he sold it because he knew some people in this family would try to take malicious advantage of him if they got their hands on it, I replied, looking directly, unblinkingly at my father and Julian. Julian jumped up slightly in his chair, suddenly intensely defensive. His face flushed a darker red. "What the hell are you insinuating, Leo?" he snapped, pointing his dessert fork at me like a weapon. "Nothing," I said calmly, resting my hands flat on the table. "Just that grandfather was significantly more astute, sharp, and aware than everyone in this room thought he was. He wasn't losing his mind. He saw everything with perfect clarity. My father looked at me with a dangerous mixture of suspicion, raw nervousness, and sudden dread. Leo, if you know something about the hotel sale, you should share it with the family immediately. You owe us that much. We have a right to know where the money went. Oh, now I'm a valued part of the family? I asked, a cold, humorless smile touching my lips. How incredibly curious. A few hours ago, I was just the poor, pathetic relative who didn't even deserve a decent room away from the deafening noise of the washing machines. Now I'm the keeper of the family secrets. An incredibly uncomfortable, suffocating silence fell over the table. Several cousins looked down at their laps. My mother desperately tried to change the subject, waving her hand dismissively and talking about the weather, but I continued, my voice steady, deep, and commanding. You know, grandfather told me many interesting things before he passed, I said, letting the words hang in the air. I spent countless hours with him in his office while you all were too busy with your important, superficial lives, your HOA meetings, and your country club golf tournaments. He told me extensively about his plans for this hotel and about what he truly wanted for his legacy. And what exactly did he say to you? Victoria asked, leaning forward, completely unable to hide her greedy curiosity. Her eyes literally gleamed at the mention of the legacy. He told me that a family business is exactly like a mirror, I replied, my voice dropping an octave. It flawlessly and ruthlessly reflects the true values of the people who run it. And he told me that you always have to be extremely careful with deceptive appearances, because the people who shout the loudest about their wealth are usually the ones drowning in debt. Julian slammed his heavy fist down hard on the table, rattling the silverware and knocking over an empty wine glass. Enough with the pathetic, poetic riddles. If you have something to say it clearly, you loser. At that exact moment, Javier, the hotel's regional director of operations, approached our table. Excuse the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. I just wanted to personally make sure everything was exactly to your liking tonight. Especially for you, Mr. Leo. Your presence is always an honor. My family observed the interaction uncomfortably, completely baffled and deeply unsettled by the profound, preferential treatment I was receiving from the highest-ranking senior staff. Everything is absolutely perfect, Javier. Thank you, I replied with a warm, genuine smile. My father's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He couldn't handle the subversion of his authority. Why the hell do they treat you like you're someone important? He demanded to know, his voice rising in anger, no longer caring who heard him. I took a deep breath. I hadn't planned to drop the hammer before the coffee was served, but the situation was rapidly escalating. The trap was fully set. I had to make the decision to spring it. Because they know my work, I replied simply, staring him down. They simply respect what I do. Drawing little logos on a laptop, Julian mocked, rolling his eyes dramatically. Wow, such a visionary. I design corporate identity and brand architecture for international Fortune 500 companies. I corrected him, my voice turning to absolute ice. My agency currently has clients on 3 different continents and over 30 full-time employees on payroll. Last year, our net revenue exceeded $3 million, and my profit margin was 28%. After taxes, I make more in a month than you make in a year, Julian. The surprise on their faces was instantaneous, raw, and beautiful. My mother literally almost dropped her crystal wine glass. Her jaw went completely slack. My father's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. You're lying? Victoria accused, her voice shrill and trembling. If you were actually that successful, you would have bragged about it non-stop. You would have bought a bigger house. Unlike some people at this table, I replied, staring directly at Julian and his flashy Rolex. I don't need constant, pathetic validation from others to know my own worth. I don't need to buy a Ferrari on a terrible loan just to impress people I don't even like. And there's a massive difference between genuine humility and allowing myself to be treated like trash. If you're so damn successful, my mother asked, her voice cracking, looking genuinely, deeply confused by this massive paradigm shift, Why did you accept staying in that horrible, noisy room? Why did you let me speak to you like that? Because I wanted to see exactly how far you would take it, I replied honestly, leaning forward, letting them feel the full, crushing weight of my gaze. I wanted to understand if there was any actual limit to the deep, toxic contempt you feel for me. I wanted to see if you possessed even a shred of basic human decency. And I got my answer. My words fell like heavy concrete slabs onto the table. For the very first time in my 32 years of life, I saw genuine, undeniable shame creeping onto some of their faces. Not on all of them, but it was a definitive start. My father opened his mouth to speak, but the real show was just about to begin. Leo, my father began, his voice low, gravelly, and deeply threatening, desperately trying to re-establish his crumbling patriarchal dominance. I don't care how many little drawing contracts you manage to hustle. You do not speak to your mother and me with that disrespectful tone. You are way out of line, and you are actively embarrassing this family in public. Apologize right now. I'm not finished, I said firmly, my voice slicing through his authority like a machete, cutting him off completely. For years, I endured your nasty comments, your pitying looks, your constant, exhausting, relentless contempt. All because I didn't follow the specific, shallow, corporate path you considered appropriate for a man. Because I chose to actually create something out of nothing instead of destroying things. Because I chose to build a real, sustainable business instead of manipulating numbers and scamming people like Julian. My hands were resting flat on the table. My voice remained incredibly steady, carrying clearly over the soft classical music. It was as if 3 decades of forced, painful silence had finally found their voice, and it was deafening. Grandfather Arthur taught me that a person's actual value isn't in what properties they possess, what cars they drive, or the fake appearances they maintain. I continued, staring down my father. It is entirely in how they treat others, especially those who can do nothing for them. He saw something in me that you could never, ever see, because you were far too busy comparing me to your superficial, broken idea of success. Julian scoffed, a desperate, ugly, guttural sound. Oh, please, give me a break. Don't bring the old man into this to justify your pathetic inferiority complex. You're just jealous of my salary and my life. You always have been, ever since we were kids. Actually, a deep, booming, authoritative voice echoed from the aisle behind me. Leo doesn't need to be jealous of your salary, Julian. He could pay your entire annual salary out of his corporate petty cash fund and not even notice the dip. The entire family practically snapped their necks turning around. Striding purposefully toward our table was Arthur Sterling, my grandfather's fiercely loyal, highly respected senior lawyer. He was wearing a sharp, custom gray suit and carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase. He wasn't alone. 2 large, imposing men in dark suits with earpieces, the hotel's private security directors, were walking exactly 2 steps behind him, their eyes scanning the table. What is the meaning of this? My father asked, his voice suddenly jumping an octave, looking extremely alarmed. Sterling? What on earth are you doing here? Arthur's estate is settled. Sterling ignored my father completely, treating him like empty air. He walked right up to my chair and gave me a deep, respectful nod. Mr. Leo, good evening. I brought the documents you requested. The perimeter is secured. Thank you, Sterling, I said, gesturing to the empty space on the white linen tablecloth in front of me. Sterling placed the heavy leather briefcase on the table, popped the gold latches with a loud click, and pulled out several thick stacks of legal documents securely bound in blue folders. The family watched, completely paralyzed by a bizarre mixture of deep nostalgia for grandfather's intimidating lawyer and profound, creeping, existential confusion. What you may not know, I said, my voice projecting clearly as I looked around the table at the terrified faces of my parents and brother, is what actually happened to this hotel and this entire estate after grandfather's death. My mother tensed visibly, her knuckles turning bone white as she gripped her napkin in her lap. Grandfather sold the hotel before dying, she practically whispered, repeating the lie they had all convinced themselves was true. We never knew to whom. The funds disappeared into offshore accounts. That's what we were told. That is not entirely accurate, Eleanor. Lawyer Sterling intervened, standing tall and imposing beside me. Arthur did not sell the Miramar Hotel. He transferred the entire estate, the land deeds, the branding rights, the massive operational accounts, and every single liquid asset into an ironclad, private trust. A trust? My father repeated, his brow deeply furrowed in absolute confusion, the color draining from his face. Why weren't we informed about this? I am his eldest son. I was supposed to be his financial proxy. I had a right to know. Because it wasn't relevant to you, Richard. Sterling replied with absolute, devastating professional coldness. The trust had a single, exclusive beneficiary, and your name was nowhere near it. All eyes at the table slowly, agonizingly turned back to me. I could physically see the gears grinding in their heads, the pieces of the puzzle violently slamming together in their minds. The preferential treatment from the chef, the expensive, bespoke suit, the absolute, terrifying confidence, the vintage champagne. It can't be, Victoria whispered, her face draining of all color, looking like she had just seen a ghost. I nodded slowly, letting the brutal reality crush them completely. Grandfather left me the hotel. All of it. I've been the sole, legal owner and CEO of the Miramar for 6 months. The silence that followed was absolute. It was suffocating, heavy, and profound. It felt as if even the air in the grand ballroom had completely stopped moving. The expressions on their faces ranged from utter disbelief to raw indignation, passing through the deepest, most profound shock I had ever witnessed on a human face. Aunt Beatrice literally dropped her fork onto her plate with a loud clatter. Julian was the first to physically recover his voice, driven by pure, narcissistic rage. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly and violently against the marble floor. "This is absurd," he yelled, his face turning an ugly, mottled shade of purple. "Why the hell would he leave it to you? Precisely you? You are the least qualified person in this entire family to run a multimillion-dollar hospitality business. You're a damn artist." "That is an excellent question, Julian," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair, crossing my legs, and looking directly at my parents. "And I think Mom might have some very specific, deeply personal ideas about exactly why he did that." My mother paled instantly. She looked like she was going to be physically sick right there on the table. I don't know what you're talking about, Leo," she stammered, her voice shaking violently, her eyes darting toward the exits. "I found your letters, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register that cut through the silence. "The ones you wrote to Grandfather over the last decade, desperately trying to convince him that I didn't deserve his attention, his love, or his inheritance. The letters where you systematically tore me down, lied about my character, and begged him to write me out of the will completely in favor of Julian." Several loud gasps were heard around the table from the extended family members. Aunt Beatrice covered her mouth in shock. My mother seemed to have physically shrunk in her chair, entirely unable to meet my eyes, her chin trembling. "I also found something else," I continued, not giving them a second to breathe. I signaled to Thomas, who stepped forward and began distributing a thin blue folder to every single family member at the table. "These are documents confirming that Dad and Julian aggressively and illegally tried to manipulate Grandfather into selling them the hotel at a massively reduced, fraudulent price shortly before his death," I explained loudly, ensuring everyone at the table understood the gravity of the betrayal. My father snatched the folder with trembling hands and ripped it open. Inside were stark, undeniable copies of their private emails, fraudulent purchase proposals, and worst of all, the false medical appraisals they had commissioned from a shady doctor to try and prove Grandfather was mentally incompetent so they could seize control of his assets. This is completely taken out of context," my father stammered, sweating profusely, looking around the room in absolute, wide-eyed panic. We were trying to protect his assets. He was old. He was making bad decisions. No, Richard, it's not out of context. Lawyer Sterling intervened, his voice booming with legal authority. Arthur showed me these exact documents. That is the exact moment he realized the horrific depth of your greed. That is when he decided to permanently modify his will and leave the entire estate in trust to Leo, the only person he truly trusted to preserve his legacy with integrity, rather than carve it up for quick cash. Julian slammed his fists on the table, knocking over a water glass, soaking the linen. This is a massive conspiracy. You manipulated the old man when he was weak. You and this crooked lawyer. You don't have what it takes to run a business like this. I'll sue you. I'll tie this up in probate court for a decade and bleed you dry with legal fees. The financial results suggest otherwise, Julian, I replied calmly, not raising my voice, letting the facts do the heavy lifting. In the 6 months since I took direct control of the Miramar, the hotel's net revenue has increased by 18%. Customer satisfaction scores have improved across the board, and we've just been nominated for 2 National Hospitality Excellence Awards. I run this place better than you run your own household finances. And as for suing me, my legal team has a war chest that would bankrupt you before we even reach discovery. Thomas nodded firmly in confirmation. The security guards behind Sterling stood a little taller, showing expressions of deep pride and absolute respect for their boss. My mother looked up at me, her eyes red, her expensive makeup beginning to run down her cheeks in dark streaks. She seemed genuinely, profoundly confused by reality. "If you are the owner," she cried, her voice cracking in pure anguish, "why did you accept staying in that horrible laundry room? Why did you allow us to treat you like that for the last 2 days? Why didn't you just tell us?" It was the exact question I had been waiting for all night. Because I critically needed to understand, I replied, feeling raw emotion finally begin to break my stoic facade, the pain of 30 years bleeding into my voice. I needed to comprehend if you really, truly saw me as a worthless human being, or if there was some deeper, darker reason for your relentless contempt. I stood up from the table. I looked down at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, but who had chosen greed instead. And what I discovered in those archives was even more painful than I could have ever imagined. It's not that you believed I had no value, Mom. It's that you were absolutely terrified of what would happen if others actually saw my value. Especially Grandfather. You tried to bury me so Julian could shine. But you forgot one thing. I am a builder. And I built my way out of the hole you put me in. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The grand ballroom was now dead silent, save for the sound of waves crashing against the beach outside. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely, the musicians watching the drama unfold with wide eyes. My mother lowered her gaze to her lap, completely unable to sustain my stare. Her shoulders were shaking uncontrollably, her perfect posture completely shattered. "The letters show it clearly, Mom," I said, my voice steady but thick with years of repressed grief. I walked slowly around the table, standing right behind her chair. "You couldn't stand that Grandfather loved me. You couldn't accept that he saw something special in me, while he saw right through your superficial, country club lifestyle. Why? What did I ever do as a child to deserve my own mother trying to actively destroy my future?" The heavy silence that followed was broken by a sudden, ugly, muffled sob. It was my mother. She seemed to have completely collapsed under the massive, crushing weight of decades of toxic secrets and malicious lies. "You were just like him," she finally murmured, her voice barely a whisper, choking on her own tears. "You had the exact same look in your eyes, the same intense way of seeing the world. When you were little, Arthur used to say you were his living image, that you had his true entrepreneurial spirit." She paused, taking a ragged, shaky breath, wiping the mascara streaks from her cheeks with a trembling hand, ruining her silk napkin. And I was always a massive disappointment to him, she confessed, the ugly truth finally spilling out after years of denial. I was never smart enough for him. I was never ambitious enough. All I cared about were clothes and parties. And then you appeared, with your creativity and your quiet determination. I saw how his eyes lit up when he talked to you, in a way they never, ever did with me. I felt like he was replacing me with you. The revelation fell like a heavy bomb in the room. Decades of bitter resentment, of twisted maternal jealousy, of a sick competition I never even knew we were having, suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. She wasn't protecting Julian. She was punishing me for having the love she felt she was denied. So you decided to make sure I never shined, I concluded, feeling a bizarre mixture of profound understanding and deep, aching pain. You convinced the whole family that I was less than nothing, that my dreams weren't worth it, just so you wouldn't feel insecure. You sacrificed your own son's mental health for your ego. My mother didn't deny it. She couldn't. She just covered her face with her hands and wept loudly. And you? I addressed my father, who was staring blankly at the fraudulent documents in his hands, as if they were written in an alien language. You saw a prime business opportunity. If I stayed marginalized, isolated, and depressed, I wouldn't be a threat to your greedy plans to steal the hotel from a dying man. You used my mother's jealousy to further your own financial fraud. My father seemed to have aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. All his bluster, his fake wealth, his patriarchal arrogance was entirely gone. His shoulders slumped. He was exposed to the entire extended family as nothing more than a desperate, cowardly fraud. Julian, meanwhile, remained standing, his chest heaving with impotent rage. He realized he had absolutely zero leverage. He had no power here. He was just a guy with a bad car loan screaming at a billionaire. "This is garbage," Julian spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You think you've won, Leo? You think you can just embarrass us and then we'll bow down to you? I don't need your damn hotel. I have my own money. I have a massive portfolio. Do you, Julian?" I asked coldly, stepping up to him until we were chest to chest. "Because my financial analysts ran a quick background check when you started talking about buying a hotel. I own the bank that holds your mortgage. Your new Ferrari is heavily financed on a terrible 12% interest rate. Your new house in the gated community is mortgaged to the hilt, and you are 2 months behind on your HOA fees. You are 1 bad quarter at the investment firm away from total bankruptcy. You are broke, Julian. You are just wearing an expensive suit." Victoria gasped, covering her mouth, looking at her husband in absolute horror. "Julian, is that true?" she demanded. Julian's face went completely pale. He couldn't speak. I had hit the nerve. "You are guests in my hotel," I announced, turning my back on him and addressing the table, my voice echoing with finality. "I could have humiliated you from the very beginning. I could have had security throw you out into the street the moment you arrived. I could have treated you exactly as you treated me. But that would only perpetuate the toxic cycle of resentment that has poisoned this family for way too long. I am breaking the cycle today." Aunt Beatrice, who had been trying to slowly inch her chair away from the table, suddenly stood up, offering a fake, trembling smile. "Leo, sweetheart, we were just going along with your parents. You know I always supported your art." "Save it, Beatrice," I snapped, cutting her off instantly. "I read your emails too. You were feeding them information about my business. You are just as complicit. Sit down and be quiet." She sat down heavily, her face burning bright red in front of everyone. "The hotel is legally mine. That will never ever change," I stated, looking at all of them. "But what we do from here as a family depends entirely on you. You can stay for the rest of the weekend, but you will respect my staff and you will respect me. If anyone crosses that boundary, Sterling will have you permanently trespassed from the property, and I will personally call the police." Clara, who had remained silent the entire time, suddenly stood up and walked over to me. Her eyes were wet with tears. "I never understood why grandfather preferred you," she said slowly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Now I see it clearly. While the rest of us desperately sought his approval and his money, you sought his wisdom. While we wanted his bank accounts, you wanted his legacy." There was no hostility in her voice, just a sad, profound acceptance of the truth. I gave her a small, tight nod. I turned to Thomas, who was watching with a satisfied gleam in his eye. "Thomas, please have my luggage transferred from room 108. I'm going to move into the owner's presidential suite on the top floor now." "Right away, Mr. Leo. It has been prepared for you," Thomas said, a genuine smile breaking across his face. 1 full year has passed since that explosive, deeply revealing family reunion at the Miramar Hotel. The thick dust has finally settled. The emotional shockwaves have slowly faded into the background, and the entire landscape of my life has drastically, permanently changed. The hotel is absolutely thriving under my direction. We implemented several massive, sweeping changes that I know in my heart my grandfather would have deeply approved of. We didn't just chase profits, we chased purpose. We launched a robust, fully funded scholarship program for young, underprivileged people from the local coastal community, helping them pay for college funds and trade schools. We completely renovated the first floor to ensure the rooms are fully adapted and accessible for people with disabilities. And we signed a firm, million-dollar commitment to environmental sustainability, completely upgrading our energy systems. My personal design agency is also breaking records, securing massive contracts I only dreamed of when I was working out of my tiny, cramped apartment years ago. But the most shocking, unbelievable transformation hasn't been the business at all. It has been the family. My relationship with my parents has evolved in ways I honestly never imagined were possible. That brutal confrontation in the ballroom shattered their massive, fragile egos, forcing them to look in the mirror for the first time in their lives. My mother, Eleanor, immediately entered intensive therapy after suffering a minor breakdown. It hasn't been easy, but we now have a weekly lunch meeting where we are slowly, painfully, but genuinely rebuilding our relationship from the ground up. She no longer seeks to aggressively compete with me or belittle my achievements to make herself feel better. She actually listens. Sometimes, when we sit down and talk about the hotel's new design projects, I can finally see in her eyes a glimmer of true, unclouded maternal pride. My father, Richard, had a much harder, more painful fall. Stripped of his false authority and facing the reality of his attempted fraud, he had to find a completely new path. Surprisingly, he found an unexpected purpose in the hotel's new community outreach program. He now volunteers his time, 40 hours a week, coordinating business activities and mentorship clinics for young, struggling entrepreneurs from the city. He recently told me, with tears in his eyes, that teaching these kids what he learned, especially warning them fiercely about his own greedy mistakes and the dangers of cutting corners, gives him a deep sense of purpose that his country club status and fake wealth never, ever provided. And then there is Julian. Julian's massive house of cards collapsed spectacularly about 3 months after the reunion. Victoria filed for divorce the moment she realized the bank accounts were empty. He lost his promotion, defaulted on his ridiculous Ferrari loan, and narrowly avoided total bankruptcy by selling his house at a massive loss. He took 6 full months to swallow his immense, toxic pride and speak to me again. When he finally walked into my executive office at the hotel, he looked completely defeated, wearing a cheap suit and looking 10 years older. But he didn't come to ask for a handout. He didn't ask for a free stake in the company. He came to ask me for a real job opportunity. I didn't give him an executive suite. I started him at the absolute bottom of the hotel's expansion and acquisitions department, working in a cubicle. He works incredibly hard now. His aggressive ambition, when properly channeled and strictly monitored by Thomas, is actually proving to be quite valuable to the company. Losing everything was the harsh, brutal wake-up call he desperately needed to become a real man. Today is the anniversary of my grandfather's passing. I'm standing inside what used to be room 108. The loud, vibrating laundry machines next door have been permanently relocated to a basement facility. The damp walls have been knocked down and rebuilt. I had the room completely transformed into a beautiful, quiet little museum that tells the long, rich history of the Miramar Hotel and its visionary founder. At the very end of the historical tour, displayed under soft, warm gallery lighting, visitors find my grandfather's final letter beautifully framed. It serves as a permanent public reminder that true family businesses are, above all else, about core values, integrity, and building a lasting legacy, not just hoarding wealth and status. Every single day when I walk through the grand marble corridors of this hotel, which is both my greatest inheritance and my heaviest responsibility, I can feel grandfather's presence guiding me. I didn't choose to drop that massive secret at the dinner table strictly out of petty revenge or spite. I did it because it was the only way to surgically lance the infected boil that was destroying our family from the inside out. I did it for the genuine possibility of healing it offered. The path hasn't been easy. There are still deeply awkward Thanksgiving dinners, moments of lingering tension, and old emotional scars that might never fully disappear. But the family we are actively building now is infinitely stronger, more honest, and vastly more authentic than the fake, plastic version we pretended to be for 30 years. As the new bronze sign I personally designed and installed at the main hotel entrance says, "We don't build walls but bridges. We don't offer rooms but homes." That is the true, beating heart of the Miramar, and it is undoubtedly the most valuable legacy my grandfather could have ever left me. There are stories that aren't just entertaining tales. They are sharp mirrors reflecting our own lives. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones holding you down, and sometimes true power isn't about crushing them into the dirt, but about having the strength to walk away, build your own empire in silence, and eventually set the hard boundaries they desperately need to heal. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to hide your success just to keep the peace? Or been treated like you were less than you are by the people who should love you most? Share your story in the comments below, because reading your experiences helps me and everyone else here realize we aren't alone in these struggles. And please, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.